Hello, everyone. This is your host, Deborah Poneman, and I'd like to welcome you to our call with today's guest, Margaret Paul. After practicing traditional psychotherapy for 17 years, Margaret felt discouraged with the results for both herself and her clients. She'd spent years trying to heal from her own dysfunctional and abusive background, but still suffered with anxiety and relationship problems. So she looked for something that worked not only quickly and deeply, but something that would help create loving relationships, inner peace, and joy, and not just for a day or a week, but permanently. Now, for over 30 years, the process she and her partner developed called inner bonding has helped thousands of people to find that place of joy and power inside of themselves. This process has been changing lives for individuals, couples, and people in business relationships. Margaret holds a Ph.D. in psychology and has appeared on numerous radio and TV shows, including The Oprah Winfrey Show. And today you're going to discover how you've been rejecting yourself rather than loving yourself. Also, the link between anxiety and depression and self-abandonment. Why loving yourself is the opposite of selfishness. The 6 steps to taking loving care of yourself. And how to access the information regarding what is loving to yourself in different situations. Wow, I am so looking forward to this. Margaret, thank you for joining us today. Welcome to the call.
Oh, thank you. I'm looking forward to it, too.
This is a topic that I could never get enough of. I think everybody feels the same way. And what I'd like you to do is to take a few minutes to share with us what you believe to be the major turning points in your life that allowed you to manifest this knowledge that's really helping so many people around the world. So tell us a little bit about your journey.
Well, I can start when I was very little in a, as you said, dysfunctional and abusive home with a raging, borderline narcissistic mother, a sexually abusive father, and I was a wreck. And, of course, like so many families, my parents thought it was my fault. And by the time I was 5, they took me to a psychiatrist. And I'll never forget, I talked to him, my mother talked to him, and I'll never forget standing there as a little girl looking up at this tall, skinny guy. And he said to me, "Tell your mother not to yell at you." And I remember thinking very, very clearly, you tell him, I'm only 5 years old. She is not going to listen to me. And then the next thought was, you don't do a very good job. I can do a better job than you. And that was when I decided that I was going to be a psychologist. That was the moment. So that was a turning point in my life at 5 years old. And I never actually wavered from that. And I became, as you said, a traditional psychotherapist. But I had been through all kinds of therapy, everything imaginable, and I was not a happy camper at all, and I was having a lot of problems in my marriage, and I realized that I just didn't want to continue to work with people in the way that I was because they had to keep coming back. If something happened that they couldn't deal with, they had to keep coming back. They didn't have a process. I didn't have a process, and so I started to pray for a process to come into my life that would really be very, very different than what I was doing. And that's when I met Dr. Erica Chopich. She had half the inner bonding process, and I had half the process. So, of course, Spirit made sure we met, and we put it together 30 years ago, and it's been evolving ever since. And that actually was the biggest turning point in my life, is discovering, is actually Spirit brought through inner bonding. They brought us together and brought through inner bonding. And as I started to practice this process, everything started to change for me in my life, everything. And so that has been the biggest turning point. It completely freed me to pursue who I am and to learn to love myself and to learn to love others, because we can't really love others if we're not loving ourselves. So it's just been phenomenal.
Well, then that leads me to my very first question, and that is, what do you really mean by loving yourself? That's such a hard concept for so many of us to grasp.
Well, see, the good thing about the inner bonding process is it's a 6-step pathway. It actually teaches people how to love themselves. sometimes, people are loving to themselves in one area but not another. Like they may take care of themselves financially, or maybe they'll take care of themselves physically, or they'll take baths and get massages and things like that, and they say that they're loving themselves. They'll eat well, they'll exercise, maybe they have a nice clean space, maybe they're the kind of person who's on time. But lots of times people do not take loving care of themselves emotionally or spiritually or relationally. This is where people really don't know what to do. They don't know how to stay connected with themselves in a relationship, how to speak their truth, how to not give themselves up, how to not try and control the other person. They don't know how to stay connected with a higher source of guidance so that they do know how to love themselves. You see, most of us had very poor role modeling for love, and so we actually haven't seen much of it. And what we train people to do is to connect with their higher wisdom and bring that in moment by moment so that we actually know what it means in any given moment to take care of ourselves with somebody else and to take care of ourselves within ourselves. And that means taking responsibility for our own feelings. That's ultimately what loving yourself means, is that we learn to take 100% responsibility for our own feelings rather than avoiding them with the many ways that we have learned to abandon ourselves. That's the opposite. If we abandon ourselves, then we're not taking care of our feelings. Would you like me to go into the ways that we abandon ourselves?
Yes, that was going to be my next question because, I hear the concept, we abandon ourselves, but I guess if we understood how we did it, then we would know how not to do it.
That's right. That's right. So I have isolated 4 major ways that we tend to abandon ourselves. One is we stay up in our head instead of staying present in our body. And we all learn to do this because when we were young, there was a lot of pain for most of us. There was a lot of deep loneliness and heartbreak and helplessness over the adults in our life, over being hurt. And so, or with peers, or, with siblings, we got hurt a lot. And most people just didn't have anybody who knew how to hold them through the pain, who knew how to really be there. In fact, too often it was the parents themselves. Like with me, my parents didn't hold me when they were hurting me. They were the ones hurting me. And so there was nobody there to be there for me to manage the deep pain. And so I learned, like most people learn, to avoid my feelings. And one of the things that we learn to do is disconnect from our body. We dissociate from our body. And we go up into our head because then we don't have to feel so much. And while we needed to do that when we were little, doing that as an adult is a form of self-abandonment. Because if you imagine an actual child who's hurting, and instead of really being there emotionally for the child, you're up playing on the computer or something, you're in your head doing something, that child's going to feel abandoned. So that's one way. And then another way is that many of us have learned to be very harsh on ourselves. We judge ourselves very harshly because we might have been judged. Most people were judged a lot. And we learn to do this to ourselves. We learn to say to ourselves, well, you're such a jerk and you're a loser and, when are you ever going to get this right? And what's wrong with you? What's the matter with you? You're just not good enough. You're never going to be good enough. You're worthless. I mean, we go on and on and on with this because that's what we learn to do. And there's a part of us that believes if we judge ourselves enough, we'll get ourselves to change and do it right. But, of course, the opposite happens. We just stay stuck in feeling really bad. And, again, like an actual child, if you kept hammering at a child how bad they were, how awful they were, they're not going to be motivated to do well. They're going to sink into feeling horrible about themselves. So that's a second way, self-judgment. And third is that many of us have learned to turn to many addictions. We might have turned to food when we were young, or as an adolescent, maybe turned to drugs, to alcohol, maybe to sex, to approval, to anger, to compliance, to spending, to work. I mean, there's just so many addictions that, the internet, so many addictions that we can turn to avoid our feelings. I mean, even something like meditation. You can meditate to connect and learn and grow, or you could meditate to bliss out and avoid responsibility for your feelings. So anything that we do to avoid feeling our feelings, learning from them, and taking responsibility for them is an addiction and a form of self-abandonment. And fourth, most of us have learned to make somebody else responsible. This is another addiction. This is like a love addiction. And we think if somebody else will only love us, if somebody else will see us and get us and understand us and value us and cherish us, then we'll be okay. And so we get addicted to trying to have control over getting love rather than learning how to be loving to ourselves so that we can actually share love. And this would be like, again, if you had a child, and instead of wanting to take care of that child, you go around and you ask everybody you meet, I'd like to give this child away to you. I don't want to take care of this child. I don't want to take care of this child's feelings. I don't want to be responsible for this child. So will you take this child? Now, if we had a child and we actually did that, that child would feel so rejected, so abandoned by us. And that's what happens on the inner level. That's how we end up feeling when we make somebody else responsible for us.
Huh. That's very interesting. I was laughing. It's not funny, but when you said if you're going to go around, will you take care of this child? I want to take care of this child. I was going to say you'd also be arrested, but
right.
That's another story.
Right.
But that is so interesting. I could see how people turn to things like sex and drugs. I never thought of the Internet, but to avoid our feelings, Internet is a great new addiction that people have.
Oh, yeah.
They could just turn to the Internet. It's just like a drug. I never thought of that before.
Oh, yeah.
But it's just another way of not taking responsibility. And is that why there's so much anxiety and depression? I can't tell you, Margaret, how many friends of mine who are long-term meditators, just by the way, who are now on medication for depression. Like, what's that about?
That's right, because depression is often the result. I mean, there's many reasons for depression, but one of the major reasons is self-abandonment because, again, if you just visualize a child and you're ignoring the child and you're judging the child and you're turning to your own addictions, you're drinking, and you hope somebody else is going to come along and take care of that child, the child's going to feel very anxious or depressed or both. Nobody's there taking care of that child. And the same thing happens on the inner level. Anxiety and depression are the consequences of self-abandonment. Now, as I said, there are, of course, other reasons for anxiety and depression. There's food. There's even things like dehydration can cause anxiety and depression. Sugar can cause it. I mean, there's a whole lot of things. Lack of sleep, abuse, all kinds of things. But this is a major reason with the people that I work with. How they treat themselves is a major cause of their anxiety or depression.
How they treat themselves. Okay. Well, here's another question. So you tell people that they should treat their inner child, their inner self, with, kindness, and there are a lot of different ways that we could do this. And I've heard people say, I think this is ridiculous, but I've heard people say that loving yourself is selfish and that it's not going to lead to something good. It's just by loving other people, then we're going to end up loving ourselves. And just loving yourself is somehow selfish. Have you ever heard anyone say that?
Oh, so often. People say that all the time, that if I love myself, aren't I being selfish? So let's take a look at what selfish really is. My definition of selfish is that when we're not taking responsibility for ourselves and we expect somebody else to give themselves up and do it for us, that's selfish. Now just think about that for a moment. Lots of times, let's say a husband wants his wife, I've seen this often, like a wife after having kids, she wants to go back to school. And the husband says, how can you be so selfish? You're going to be taking time away from me and the kids. Now, in reality, he's the one being selfish because he's not supporting her in doing what would bring her joy. He's wanting her to give herself up for him and the kids. So he's being selfish because he's not taking care of himself. He's expecting her to do it for him. Or, let's say he's wanting to have sex, and she's not feeling turned on. And he says, you're so selfish, what about me? But in reality, he's the one being selfish because he's not concerned with how come she's not turned on, what's going on between them. Or a wife says to her husband who has to travel for work a lot, and she doesn't know how to take care of herself, and she says, how can you be so selfish as to travel so much? You see, but she's making him responsible for her. Now, if each of these people were actually taking responsibility for themselves, for learning how to love themselves and make themselves happy, then they would not be blaming their partner. They would be supporting, loving, sharing their love, valuing their partner. Just imagine if we had a planet where everybody was taking responsibility for their own pain and their own joy, for filling themselves up with love, and that's a process, learning how to fill yourself up with love so that they have love to share with each other. What kind of planet would we have? Would it be a selfish, self-centered planet, or would it be a very kind and loving planet? I mean, obviously, it would be a kind and loving planet because everybody would have a lot of love to share, and that's what happens when we take loving care of ourselves. Taking loving care of ourselves, loving ourselves, is not, well, I'm going to take care of me and I don't care about you. That is selfishness. But that's not actually loving oneself. It's never loving oneself to just say, well, that's your problem, or I'm just going to take care of me and I don't care about you. That isn't loving to oneself. That will never make you feel good about yourself or happy or joyful inside. That's what the ego-wounded self does. That's what the ego-wounded self thinks is being loving. Well, I'm just going to take care of me and you just have to take care of you. That's never loving. In a good relationship, yes, we do take responsibility for our feelings, but part of loving ourselves is also being there for each other. It's being kind, it's being caring, it's having each other's back. It's truly caring about not only ourselves but each other. And really, I don't think anybody can feel good about themselves when they're not caring about other people, when it's just about them. And I think that, unfortunately, there's so much on our planet that is selfish, that's based on greed. It's like, well, I just want to make this money, and I don't care how I ruin, the crops or the environment or the air or whatever. I just want this. That is selfishness. And they could say, well, I'm just taking care of myself, but that's not what we're talking about at all. That's not loving to oneself or loving to anybody else.
Well, it's interesting, Margaret, because when you said, that the husband wants sex and the woman doesn't want sex, and sometimes she'll just go along, and that's not taking care of herself. But it's kind of a fine line, because what if the husband feels like he doesn't ask for it very often, but he feels like he's going to put himself out there even at the risk of rejection and ask for it as a way of loving himself. So there are times where one person is doing a thing that's very loving for themselves, but it involves another person.
No, but it's not, you see, because if he's expecting sex and saying that it's loving to himself, to expect sex from his wife who might not be turned on because there's some things going on in their relationship that are not working, then he's likely using sex as a form of addiction to fill himself up or take away his anxiety or, get to sleep or define himself. Lots of times men or even women use sex to say, well, that, if this person makes love to me, then I'm okay. So that's not necessarily loving. That's using it as an addiction. What would be loving would be to reach out for sex, and if the woman is not, or if the person, the man or woman, isn't interested, to be open to learning. This is what we teach, to be open to learning and to say, we don't seem to make love very often, and there must be a good reason, and I wonder if there's something going on between us, and I really am open to hearing about what's happening for you and what you feel that's going on between us that is causing the lack of sex between us. That's loving, you see. We teach that in the inner bonding process that there's only one of two intentions at any given moment. One is the intention to protect against pain with some form of controlling behavior, and the other is the intention to learn about loving oneself and the other person. So if he's asking for sex and then she says no and then he gets mad, he's trying to control her. That's not loving. But if she says no and he opens to learning and he says, let's work on this, let's discover, then that's loving.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I can't wait any longer. What are the steps? I know you give 6 steps of inner bonding. Can you share those with us?
Yes. So step 1 of inner bonding is the willingness to feel your feelings, including your painful feelings, and want responsibility. It's a decision. Okay, I'm not going to abandon myself. I'm not going to stay in my head. I'm not going to judge. Not going to turn to addictions. Not going to make somebody else responsible. I'm going to go inside and feel the feelings that I have. And we differentiate 2 kinds of feelings. There's the feelings that we cause by our self-abandonment. This is the anxiety, the depression, guilt, shame, anger, emptiness, aloneness. These are feelings that we cause by abandoning ourselves, and we need to go inside and feel them in order to learn how we're abandoning ourselves. The second group of feelings are the life feelings, the existential feelings of life, which is the loneliness when, you want to love somebody and connect with somebody and nobody's around, or the person is not available, or the heartbreak over loss, over, painful things happening, grief, and helplessness over other people is very, very hard feeling. So, there's more core feelings, but these are the major ones. These are the feelings of life, and these are the feelings that we learned to avoid when we were little. Well, now we got to be willing to embrace the loneliness and the heartbreak and the helplessness and the grief and the sorrow and the sadness. We have to embrace them and learn from them and learn to be very compassionate about them. So that's step 1, is the willingness to feel all of our feelings with compassion and a desire to take responsibility for them. It's important to realize that our painful feelings, like loneliness and heartbreak, exist in the same place in the heart as does love and joy and peace and aliveness. So we cannot shut down these painful life feelings without shutting down the wonderful feelings of life as well. And so if people are feeling kind of deadened and flat, it's because they've been avoiding the core painful feelings because they're afraid of them, but that means they're shutting out the joyful ones as well. So step 1, the willingness to feel all of our feelings and want responsibility. Step 2 is we move into the heart, and we move into an intention to learn. We consciously choose an intention to learn, which creates what we call the loving adult self. The wounded ego self is in the intention to control. The loving adult self is in the intention to learn about loving ourselves and others. And as part of step 2, we teach people how to open to their higher self, their higher source of guidance, of love, their source of love and wisdom, and to bring that in, bring that kindness and compassion into their heart. And that's part of being that loving adult self. And then in step 3, it's like we're talking to a child. We're dialoguing. We imagine that the part of us that have the feelings is a child, and we're an adult. And we're going to be dialoguing with that child, and we're going to be asking, is there something that I'm doing or something I'm telling you, some way I'm treating you that's causing you to feel bad? Am I abandoning you, or is there something happening, with another person or a situation that's causing these feelings? And so we're going inside to really, like with an actual child, with kindness. If we say to a child, well, what's wrong? They're not likely to tell us because they don't feel safe. But if we say, honey, I can see you're upset, and I really want to understand. Is there something that I'm doing that's hurting you, or something else that's happened? And we really want to know, the child is likely to let us in. So that's one part of step 3. And then if we discover some ways that we're abandoning ourselves, like let's say we're judging ourselves. Let's say we go in and we feel anxious, and we realize we're judging ourselves. We're putting a lot of pressure on ourselves. You got to do this. You got to say that. You got to be perfect. You got to do it right. A lot of pressure, and that's creating a lot of anxiety. Then we go to that ego-wounded part of us, which is, it's located in the base of our brain called the amygdala. It's a survival part of our brain that is responsible for fight or flight, and it gets programmed with tons of false beliefs. So we move into an intention to learn compassionately, again, without judgment, about, okay, let's say we're judging ourselves, and we say to that part, there must be a good reason that you're judging this little child. What do you believe about that? What's the belief about what judgment's going to do? And so that ego-wounded self might say, well, it's going to motivate me. It's going to get me to do things better, which is obviously a false belief. It's not working well. And even if people are doing well, they're generally going to discover that they're doing it in spite of the self-judgment and not because of it. So we're doing a deep process of looking at what we're doing or looking at what's happening, externally with somebody and looking at our false beliefs so that we can become aware of the beliefs that are fueling our unloving, self-abandoning behavior. And then once we get a clear picture, we go to step 4. And step 4 is having a dialogue with our higher guidance, whatever that is for a person. It can be their concept of God or an angel. It can be their higher self. It can be just a light, an energy. It can be a teacher, an old wise person, an older aspect of themselves, whatever works well for them. It really doesn't matter what their image is. If they're open to learning about the truth and about loving themselves, they are going to access that wisdom. So in step 4, we're saying, well, what is the truth about any false beliefs that I've uncovered? And what is the loving action towards myself? And we learn to sort of surrender. We learn to let go, not to try and control getting answers, but to let go. Because thoughts come into our mind from 2 different places. They come from our mind when we're in that ego-wounded self, but they come through our mind when we're open to our higher guidance. And it takes time to discern the difference between thoughts that come from the mind and thoughts that come through the mind. But the thoughts that come from the mind are programmed thoughts, and they're not based on the truth. Most creative people, like a musician or an artist or a writer, they've had the experience of, let's say, sitting down to create a piece of music and having it come through them. Like, it's not coming from their mind. They realize that it's coming through them, that they get an experience of that. And I have that all the time when I write, when I paint. It's just coming through. I can't do it from my mind. I can only do it when I let go and allow it to come through. And, people like Einstein and Edison have written about this, about that when you're truly in an open creative process, it's coming through you, not from you. So in step 4, we teach people how to do that, how to access their higher guidance and allow that information of the truth and the loving action to come through them. Then in step 5, we take the loving action, whatever we've been guided to do. In step 4, we now take in step 5. Without the loving action, it just doesn't mean that much. So we take the loving action based on the truth, and then once we take the action in step 6, we go inside and we evaluate, how am I feeling as a result of this loving action that I've taken? Am I feeling some relief, a lessening of pressure, a lessening of anxiety or depression or guilt or shame or anger? Am I managing my loneliness better? Is it okay that I'm feeling so helpless over somebody? We're handling it better, and there's a lightening up of the feelings as a result of the loving action. And if there isn't a lightening up, then we have to go back through the steps again, because it means that we didn't actually take a loving action. So that's a very brief summary of a very profound process. It's like anything worth learning. It takes practice, a lot of practice. But, hopefully as people practice, they eventually integrate it into their lives. It becomes their way of being, and that's what changes everything. That's what changed everything in my life.
Well, it's interesting because these steps, on the surface, it's like, oh, my gosh, can I really do this? I know that you have a beautiful offer for us later on, and I know it'll help us do this with your guidance. But it's really not that hard. When you look at them, they're so logical and they flow. And I have to say, this thing to differentiate between thoughts that come through the mind and from the mind, that alone is worth the price of admission. Right? Because when they come through you, those are the thoughts that lead you to your highest good. And when they come from the mind, they often get you in trouble.
That's exactly right. And it does take time to discern the difference, but there really is a big difference. Usually the thoughts that come from the mind, they can scare you. They can make you anxious, make you depressed. But thoughts that come through the mind are not scary. Yeah. Not that they can't be challenging, because sometimes taking the loving action is challenging, but they're not there to scare us. They don't create anxiety or depression or guilt or shame or anger, any of that. So our feelings really let us know whether these thoughts are coming from our mind or through our mind. People often say, well, how do I know it's my higher guidance? And I say, well, what do you feel? How does it feel when you tell yourself whatever you're telling yourself? If it feels bad, if it feels scary, it's from your mind. It's from your ego-wounded mind. It's not from your higher guidance.
Sometimes people say, well, if it's scary, that's protecting you, because if you would go with it, then something bad would happen. But I guess that would be through you also. It could be scary in a different way, like just a little gentle nudge, go in a different direction.
Well, for example, I was driving home on the freeway one night, back from teaching a workshop. It was like 10 o'clock at night, and I wasn't driving real fast. I was just driving along. And I heard the voice of my guidance quite loud. Sometimes she's really loud, and it was like she was yelling in my ear. I thought there was somebody in the back seat. And she said, slow down. Now, it wasn't a scary voice. There was nothing scary in her voice at all. Her voice did not frighten me. It was just a very firm voice. She said, slow down. So I listened, because I've learned, thank God, I've learned to listen. I slowed down. And then seconds after I slowed down, a drunk driver careened across the freeway and missed me by inches. And if I hadn't slowed down, I would have been broadsided and probably killed, because he was really careening across. And so to me, that voice is a reassuring voice. It's a powerful voice. It's a voice that is there to protect me for sure, but it's not a scary voice.
Okay, I get it. It could be firm, but it's never scary. Okay, here's another question. How can you know what is loving to yourself? I already asked about the one with sex, if the partner wants sex, and what is loving if you have it when you don't want it, that whole thing. But how can you know what's loving to yourself in different situations when it does involve other people? Is there anything else that you could just tweak a little bit? Because that seems to be, I think, for a lot of people, especially with your kids, because don't we have to sacrifice for our kids?
Well, see, one of the things that we teach is that if it's not loving to us, it's not loving to anybody else. Now, when you talk about sacrifice, certainly, you have a baby, and then you have to get up a lot at night, and you're sacrificing your sleep. But for me, I really wanted to be a good mom, and so even though I didn't really want to be getting up, it didn't feel that much like a sacrifice, because my intention was to be loving to both my child and to me. And since that was the intention, I could not live with myself if I, let a baby cry. And so it didn't actually feel like a sacrifice, even though I was exhausted. But as children grow, I tell parents that part of one half of being a good parent is being there for our children. When I had kids, I really wanted to be a very different parent than how my parents were, who were not there for me at all. So I really wanted to be there for my kids. But I didn't realize at that time, until they were a little older, that the other half of parenting is being there for myself and role modeling how to take loving care of myself so that they could learn that. And so, when they were younger, I was, Mother Earth, there for them, completely sacrificing myself to the point where, I was on the verge of creating bratty kids who felt entitled because I didn't take care of myself at all. And fortunately, that's when inner bonding came in, and I started realizing, wait a minute, I am not role modeling anything good for them by being there for them and not being there for myself. So that's when I started to tune in. And the way that we know whether we're being loving or not is how it feels. And this is where the practice comes in, because when I started to practice inner bonding, I was completely tuned out from my own feelings. I was in my head. I was not in my body at all. I was very tuned into other people's feelings and completely tuned out to my own feelings. It took me a number of years before I could stay present in my body. I was so tuned out, and I really didn't even know how to go about remembering to tune in. It just took me time to learn to do that. Once I remembered to stay in my body, then I could get the feedback that I needed, because if it's not feeling good, it's not loving. If it feels good inside, if it feels right, if it feels honest and true and in integrity, then it's loving. But if it feels like there's something wrong with it, it's not loving. And so then I started really learning that caretaking somebody else was not loving. I was a huge caretaker. That it wasn't loving. It was controlling, actually, that trying to please everybody and, take care of everybody else's feelings and not mine was actually very controlling, because my intention was to try and get love, and that's very different than being loving. It's a completely different intention when we're trying to get love than when we're loving ourselves and then being loving with others. And so I realized I was trying to get love, and that wasn't loving, and it didn't feel good inside. And so I realized that caretaking them wasn't loving, or getting angry didn't feel good inside. That wasn't loving. And so as I learned to tune into my feelings of what felt right and true and in integrity on the inner level, that started leading me to what truly was loving. Now, I can't say that any of that was easy, because, when you've been a caretaker your whole life, giving yourself up to everybody else and not at all tuning into yourself, boy, everybody expects you to do that, and then when you stop doing it, they're all mad at you. And so, I went through a really tough time. I had to be willing to have everybody be mad at me in order to stop caretaking everybody. But the fact was, I was getting quite ill at that time, because you can't do that forever without it taking a huge toll on your body. And I realized that if I kept allowing myself to be drained and giving myself up and not taking care of myself, I was going to die. I was headed in that direction. So I knew that if I was going to live, I had to have the courage to have everybody mad at me and maybe some people leave and all that, in order to really start to be true to myself, take loving care of myself so that I could be loving with others.
Wow, Margaret, that is so profound. And, when you said you have to have the courage to have people mad at you, many of us are just so afraid to disappoint other people, to have them mad at you, to not keep your word because you've committed to something, and even if it kills you, you're going to have the commitment, keep the commitment. And I love also that you said it's not loving them, it's controlling them. And I see a lot of parents, and I have to say myself included, that I want to give to my kids, but when you get to the bottom of it, it's just because I so much want them to love me.
That's right. That's what I wanted. I wanted them to love me. But in fact, they weren't respecting me very much.
Right.
Because I wasn't respecting myself. People tend to treat us the way we treat ourselves.
This is priceless. And I know that you have a process that you are going to take us through. Is this a good time?
Yes, this would be great. I could take people through a little bit of the inner bonding process right now.
Yeah.
So let's do that. So let's have everybody who's listening just close your eyes for a moment and take some deep breaths and go inside and just follow your breath. Use your breath to get out of your head and go into your body, breathing inside, getting present inside your body right here, right now. Just breathing, relaxing, sinking into your body with the breath, and noticing what you're feeling right now. Noticing any anxiety or depression or emptiness or aloneness or flatness or excitement or joy or whatever's in there. Just notice without any judgment, without avoiding anything. Notice if there's loneliness. Notice if there's grief, heartbreak, helplessness. Just notice, breathing into those feelings, and see if you can find a place in you that actually wants responsibility for those feelings. We all have a place in us that, in our soul, that knows that we actually do have to do this. So see if you can find that. Now, I'm not going to go through the entire inner bonding process because that would take too long. But what I'm going to do is help the listeners to start to connect with their spiritual guidance so that they can begin to know what to do with these feelings. And so I'd like you to move into your heart, breathing into your heart, and consciously choose the intention to learn. Consciously choose that you really, really do want to learn from all of your feelings. All feelings are informational. And as you're opening to learning, just use your imagination and imagine an older, wiser you. Like you 50 years from now, 100 years from now. An older, wiser you. Just get an image of that. Or any image that suits you. But lots of times an older, wiser form of ourselves is fairly easy for people to imagine. But if you're in touch with another form of higher guidance, that's fine too. And I'd like you to just imagine that you can have a conversation with this older, wiser part of you. And you're asking this higher part of you, what do these feelings, imagine that whatever it is you're feeling as a child inside, what does this child in me need from me right now? What does this child need from me right now to start to feel important to me, to start to feel like I value him or her? And just open. And don't try and control what happens. Maybe nothing will happen. Maybe the answer will come in an hour or a day if you stay open to it. We don't have control over when we hear the higher voice. But something might come through. And the voice might say, well, that child just needs you to listen, or just needs you to hold, maybe pick up a dollar bear and hold that child, or may need you to speak up for him or her with somebody, or may need you to get to bed earlier, or may need you to eat better or get some exercise, or, it could be any kind of thing. But just see if you can tune into what would a higher, wise self say to you, that if you had an actual child right now who is feeling what you feel, what would you do to help that child to feel loved and cared for? Certainly one of the things would be to move into kindness and compassion. And that's one of the first things we always need to do, is move into kindness and compassion for whatever it is we're feeling. That alone will help the feelings. And then there may be any other loving action that your higher guidance might ask you to do. So just breathe that in and imagine taking that loving action. Just use your imagination, imagine taking it. And then notice how you feel as a result of taking it. Now, you might not get anything the first time around, but I assure you that if you keep practicing this, you're going to get a lot of information. One of the things that I encourage people to do all day long is to practice saying to their higher guidance, what is loving to me right now? I do it with everything. I say, what is loving to put in my body? What's the loving food to put in my body? What's the loving action to take right now? If I'm with another person and it's not feeling good, and I'm aware that it's not feeling good, I go and say, what's loving to me right now? Is it loving to ask the person what's going on? Is it loving to me to just disengage from the conversation? What would be loving to me in this situation? So I just encourage people all day long to get in the habit of saying, what is loving to me right now?
That was so profound for me, Margaret.
Oh, good.
That was so utterly profound. And I kept trying to say, no, you don't want me to do that. Because it would take me, some time and some sacrifice. And that little Deborah would not let go of what that little Deborah needs. That would be loving to her right now.
Yeah. And if you actually imagine doing it, how would you feel?
So peaceful and blissful, and I'm going to do it.
That's great.
I'm going to do it.
That's great.
I really am. This just must be my day. I hope all of the listeners are feeling this way, that this is just what they needed to hear at the right time, and this being the right time. But, Margaret, it's always the right time with you, because there's just something about your knowledge is brilliant and your presence is nourishing. And I felt that when we've had other interviews, and I feel it again today. And, I would love for you to do right now, can you share with everybody some of the turnarounds that you've seen from people who have applied what you teach? Because I want people to know what's possible for them.
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's been so many, but, one that's kind of typical is this woman who came to me. She's actually a therapist, and she'd been working on herself for years, and she had clinical depression, and she had been on medication, and she had tried everything for this clinical depression. But it was obvious that she, coming from her background, she had no idea how to take loving care of herself, and as she learned to do it, over a period of time, her depression went away, and she was able to get off all medication. And as long as she continued to take loving care of herself, her depression went away. So this is a very, very common situation that I see that happens with inner bonding. I had a man who had been an alcoholic for years, and as he started to do inner bonding and he realized his level of self-abandonment, he made a firm decision. He said, I'm not going to abandon my little boy anymore with alcohol. He realized that that's what he was doing to avoid his feelings, and he just stopped. I mean, most people don't just stop, and he did. He just stopped, and he never went back to drinking. And I've had this experience over and over again, whether it's food, where people realize it. I've had people say, I've lost 100 pounds because I finally realized how I was abandoning myself and using food as a form of doing that. I've had people stop very heavy drug addictions, heroin and things like that, because they learned inner bonding and they realized that they were deeply abandoning themselves and that that's why they were using the drugs. And I've had people who have gone to recovery centers over and over and over again and never been able to stop their addiction until they started doing inner bonding, because then they finally got what they had been doing and what they have to do differently. And once they started to do it, they didn't want to be abandoning themselves with their addiction. And their depression, their anxiety went away because of loving and valuing themselves.
Okay, well, I would love for everybody to be able to take a look at this special offer that you created for us. And I'm going to give everyone the URL, and I highly encourage you to go and take a look at Margaret's special offer. And the URL is LiveBigMedia.com /yourself, YOURSELF, yourself. Or you can just click on the special offer button that's on the web page. So, Margaret, can you let everyone know what they'll find there?
Yes, this is a really wonderful program. It's called Love Yourself, and what will happen when you sign up for it is you will be receiving an email from me for 30 days. It's a 30-day at-home course. And for 30 days, you're going to receive an email, and each day there's a lesson. And at the end of the lesson, there's an action step to take, so that this is going to teach you the inner bonding process. And in the email, sometimes there's going to be a video, sometimes there's going to be an audio visualization. And so as you go through the 30 days, it will only take about 15 minutes a day, not more than 15 minutes a day. As you go through it, you will be learning the inner bonding process in a pretty deep and profound way. So this is one of the least expensive ways of really learning the inner bonding process in a fairly in-depth way. So I really encourage people who want to learn this process to take advantage of this offer, because it really is a very wonderful course. The feedback that I've had from it is phenomenal.
Well, I'm first in line, because I have to tell you, I'm still recovering from that experience that I had. And usually I stay on top of things a little bit more because I am the interviewer. But it was just really profound, and I am definitely interested in going deeper. And I just have to make a comment that 30 days for 10, 15, 20 minutes a day is really a very, very small investment of time to have a life that is going to look really, really different.
Right. I mean, I've had people say to me, my friend referred me to this, and it's the best thing anybody has ever offered me. It's changed my life.
Yeah, well, I have to tell you, it changed my life. Just the one thing, I'm still recovering from my experience, but the one thing that became so clear that I need to do, that has already changed my life just in this 1 hour, and I am so looking forward to doing this 30 days, and thank you for this fabulous offer. So, what do you believe will be the kind of the short-term benefits? So we start the 30 days, and what do you see that people start experiencing right away, even before the 30 days or even before 10 days are up? What do you see that are the first things that people start experiencing? Long range, we've already heard a lot, but what are the first things that people start to experience?
Well, what they've said to me is that right away they start to feel lighter, they start to feel more hope, they're seeing a light at the end of the tunnel, they're starting to really get a sense of what they've been doing that's causing them problems and what they can do differently. So right away they start to feel better. They don't have to wait till the end of the 30 days to feel better. They're going to start to feel better right away, because even just starting step one of getting present starts to make people feel better. So right away they're going to feel a lightening up of their energy, a lightening up of pain that they've been in.
Okay, beautiful. That's what I wanted to know. Well, then my last offer to you, or offer to everybody, besides giving them the URL one more time, which is LiveBigMedia.com/yourself, YOURSELF, or you could simply click on the special offer button that's on this page. And can you just give us a few more words of wisdom? I just love everything that you share. I love who you are. And if you have some final words, we would just so appreciate that.
Well, the thing I really want people to know is that, most people really want to have a loving relationship and have loving relationships with people in their lives. And of course we do. We're social beings and we want that. This course is the basis for that, because as you learn to love yourself, as I've said, you move beyond your neediness, you move beyond trying to control getting love, and you really learn to share love. And so what happens, even if you're in a relationship and your partner doesn't take the course, still one person can shift a relationship around. And so as you do it and you start to shift your end of the system, you will notice that most of the time the relationship system gets better. I mean, of course, I can't guarantee if you've been a caretaker and you stop doing it, there might be some turmoil for a while, but most of the time the relationship improves, because as you're being more loving and kinder to yourself, you're also able to be more loving and kinder to your partner. So this is a profound way of improving your relationship.
Okay, we want it all. Well, Margaret, thank you so much for being with us today. This has, as always, been beyond amazing. I just
thank you so much, Deborah. You're such a good interviewer. I love being interviewed by you.
Well, I love your work, so I just am always thrilled to interact with you, and I just thank you for everything you're doing for so many people on the planet.
Oh, it's my joy and my passion to help as many people as I can. So I'm delighted to be here doing this with you.
Well, thank you. And thank you to everyone for spending this time with me and with Margaret Paul. And I look forward to when we're all together again. This is Deborah Poneman. Have a wonderful rest of your day.